by the US government. The private sector often plays a big role. They have capacities and they should always be invited and included in any disaster response. Militaries are often a member of the response community. If you can think back to the tsunami that hit the Indian Ocean countries back in 2005, the US military responded vigorously to that crisis because US military has logistic capabilities in terms of ships, trucks, helicopters, airplanes, et cetera, that are beyond the capacities of a lot of countries that are affected by crises, and certainly beyond the capacity of UN agencies and NGOs. Regional organizations will also be involved, like the Organization of American States, or ASEAN. Okay, so the next question is, what kind of aid is needed in the aftermath of some kind of disaster, whether it's a conflict or an earthquake, a tsunami, et cetera? And it really is context specific. You can't say that every two disasters are the same. They're all unique, and you have to go in and assess what those needs might be. So food is a major requirement often in times of crisis and disaster. Water, sanitation, and hygiene, elemental, I think, for survival. Healthcare, nutrition, shelter, certainly, because oftentimes people's homes are damaged or destroyed completely in the aftermath of an event. Education for children. It's important to keep education going for the young kids so they don't fall behind. Oftentimes we have to build refugee camps or displaced persons camps after a crisis. So camp coordination and management is another key type of aid that is provided. And then of course we have what's called early recovery, because even as soon as you start responding to the emergency needs, you have to start helping people put their lives back together with early recovery efforts. Another couple of things that aren't directly related to assisted people but help with the overall operation are emergency telecommunications, protection for people who are affected by the crisis, and then logistics. You need, huge amounts of logistics, trucks, airplanes, helicopters, et cetera, to move, emergency assistance, across, large swaths of the globe very quickly in a timely fashion. So one thing that's important to remember too is we try and base our work off of core humanitarian principles. So we try and make sure that we're neutral, that we're not involved in supporting one side or the other in a conflict situation when we're delivering humanitarian assistance. We need to be impartial. In other words, we give assistance to anybody who's in need. We base it on need, not on what your race is, your religion, your nationality, et cetera. It's just based on, do you have a need? Then of course we'll meet it because we're impartial. Independence, we don't take direction, as humanitarian agencies from governments. We try not to anyhow. We try and make sure that we're independent and able to act based on the core humanitarian principles that I just mentioned, neutrality and impartiality, and also humanity. We're just basing this on the fact that we're all, human beings. Then when a crisis hits, we should rush to each other's aid. Okay, how we operate. First of all, we need to do a needs assessment to understand, how the event has impacted people's lives, what they need. And then we do a round of strategic planning to put together sort of a plan, how we're going to address those needs as quickly as possible. And then we have to mobilize resources. We have to get funding. So we have to go around to different donors and ask them for assistance in terms of financial support. And then we do the implementation and monitoring of the programs to assist people. And finally, we try and do a review and evaluation to see what we did well and what could be improved maybe the next time. So humanitarian assistance comes in different forms. Sometimes it's in kind, like you can think of bags of wheat or cans of vegetable oil and so forth, blankets, bars of soap, et cetera, physical items we can actually pass out to people. But oftentimes in situations where markets are still functioning after disaster, we can do what we call cash programming. So we give them cash assistance and they can go and buy what they need from the markets and the shops that are still functioning. We work in a lot of different kinds of environments, some totally benign where there's no threat, no hostility towards the aid workers, and all along the spectrum to the other side where it's very hostile, where aid workers are actually targeted with violence. And there's been many cases where aid workers have been killed, kidnapped, and sexually assaulted. It's just the reality of the places that we work in. Now, the US government, our government is a major player. It's usually the largest donor to humanitarian needs worldwide year after year. So in 2019, the last year that I have data for, the US government contributed $7 billion worldwide to international humanitarian assistance efforts, mainly through United Nations agencies, NGOs, and the Red Cross. Now, just to put that in perspective, that's, seems like a lot of money. Yes, $7 billion, but that's only about 1/10 of 1% of the U.S. federal budget for fiscal year 2019, which was about $4.45 trillion. As I just mentioned, the U.S., was the largest donor to worldwide humanitarian efforts in 2019. Other large donors being the United Kingdom, Germany, the European Union, and plus some up and coming donors like the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia. Okay, so how can you help people impacted by a crisis? That's often a question I get from friends and family members when I come back for some of these humanitarian disasters. Well, you can join a humanitarian agency. They're always looking for good people to come in and support their efforts. UN agencies, NGOs, and the Red Cross. You can contact your federal representatives to make sure that we as the US government, we as the American people are continuing to contribute generously to humanitarian efforts around the world, and also to advocate for getting involved in ending conflicts. So if we end the conflicts, we can end the need for humanitarian assistance in many instances. Or you can make a financial contribution to a reputable humanitarian aid agency that's on the ground assisting people in need in various crises. So how to help, really, if you're going to make that financial contribution, cash is the preferred over in-kind contributions. Oftentimes people will want to send what they have maybe in their cupboard, some food or clothing, but it's very expensive to send that food halfway across the world. And oftentimes it's not culturally appropriate, it's not needed. So it's better that the support you provide is demand driven rather than supply driven. So we always recommend cash, and you can get more information about that from this group sponsored by the US government called the Center for International Disaster Information, and the web address is there below, www.cd.org. So I think that's it. I kind of met my 15-minute timeline more or less, and I'm ready to answer any questions you might have.
Well, Doug, thank you very much for that. That was hugely interesting. I have just one quick question, and we do have some by chat as well. My question is very general, very, very basic.
Mm-hmm.
Although it's a very small percentage of our federal budget, $7 billion is nothing to sneeze at. Why should we spend that money as US taxpayers on international humanitarian assistance when there are so many unmet needs here at home in the US? Over to you.
Right. Well, I think that's always the question, isn't it? And it is a lot of money, even though it's a relatively, very small percentage of the US budget. But I don't know, because I always say it's the morally, it's the correct thing to do, right? You go to some of these places and you see the people, and these are people just like you and me. They may come, from different cultural backgrounds. They may speak a different language. They may practice a different religion, but they're human beings just like you and I. And I don't know, most of us, we walk outside our home, we see someone, who's been hit by a bus or fell down and broke their leg. Would you just walk by and saying, well, I'm a busy guy, I don't have time of the day for that. I think most of us would stop and render assistance. And I think, most American citizens, don't see the direct suffering, except perhaps on the TV news from time to time. But I think morally, I think most Americans wouldn't just turn away and say, that's not my problem, I can't help out. We are, the wealthiest nation in the world. And I think there is a moral obligation, to provide assistance to those who have needs. We want to be a leader in the world. And this is one way we're expressing our leadership by being the first to respond to crises around the world and coming in with the greatest amount of resources. So, yeah, I like I said, just imagine that some of these people in refugee camps around the world were members of your family or your neighbors. Would you want somebody to come and assist them? I suspect you would, because I think we all have compassion at the end of the day in our hearts. So I think, it boils down to be, I think, morally the right thing to do.
Thanks, Doug. We've got a question from one of our participants. How large does a humanitarian crisis have to be in order for it to be responded to on an international level, or what are the parameters that play into such a decision?
Yeah, well, that's a very interesting question. We have crises going on the world right now where you have, tens of millions of people affected by the emergency. Let's take Syria, for example. I think there's over 11 million people in need of humanitarian assistance linked to the ongoing conflict in Syria. Then a couple of years ago, there were wildfires in Greece. And I think, there was under 10,000 people affected by those wildfires. Hurricane Dorian, which I responded to myself, I was involved in the response to Hurricane Dorian in the Bahamas late last year. I think it was under 40,000. So you have some crises where it's like tens of thousands of people affected, and others where it's tens of millions. And I think we have an obligation to respond to all of them. If if meeting the needs of the people affected is beyond the capacity of the government that's affected, then I think the international community has to step in. Of course, we don't have all the resources we need. We have to prioritize. We have to triage. What are the greatest emergencies? What are the greatest needs? Where are people most likely to die and suffer? But yeah, I think there's no crisis that's too small. If there's a requirement, then the international community will respond, especially if the country affected just doesn't have the capacity, whether the financial means or the technical means or the number of personnel who can adequately respond.
Thanks, Doug. Another question from me. Now, we are in a very strange place in these days with COVID-19. I think most of us here who are participating have seen pictures of, let's say, refugee or internally displaced people's camps, very squalid, overpopulated, with oftentimes very difficult conditions. I assume, without being an expert, that would very much be of concern for spread of this virus. What is the humanitarian community? How do they understand it? And how is that playing into response around the world?
Yeah, well, I think the humanitarian community is still trying to come to grips with what the COVID, virus means for people living in refugee camps or displaced camps. I mean, as difficult it is for most of us here in the United States, at least we have generally access to clean water. We can wash our hands without any difficulty. There's still food in the supermarkets, et cetera. We can social distance ourselves with relative ease. Most of us, not everybody, but most of us. But if you go to a refugee camp or a displaced person camp, oftentimes people are crowded. They don't have 6 feet between them. I mean, these tents are packed right next to each other, and they're very small. So, most of us will have a house where we can stay in and we can be relatively comfortable. If you have 7, 8, 10 people packed in a small tent, staying in that tent all day is just not really feasible. And then the question is, do they have access to running water? How easy it is to get access to water and soap, et cetera? Are the food supplies going to be guaranteed? Because many of the humanitarian agencies that deliver this assistance in these crisis settings, they're experiencing disruptions due to the COVID virus, because many countries are closing their borders. So it's hard for relief workers to travel to some of these locations. It's hard for them to send supplies to some of these locations because, again, countries are closing off their borders, trying to slow down the spread of the virus. So it's becoming a much more complicated situation for the hundreds of millions of people already in need of humanitarian assistance due to conflict or natural disasters. Then you add this additional layer of COVID-19 on top of it, and it's going to be a real challenge.
I can only imagine what it's like in some of these places, Doug. Hugely challenging already, and now with the COVID-19, even more so. Here's something from another participant. What do you see as the future of humanitarian response? Will it be focused more on natural disasters or one of the other categories you mentioned?
Well, I mean, I think it's going to be both natural disasters and conflict. I mean, conflict just seems to be on the rise around the world. The instability that's spreading across many parts of the world. If you look at West Africa right now, the Sahel region, conflict there is only spreading, year by year, more people having to flee their homes and in need of humanitarian assistance. But also with the impact of climate change, that's also making it much more difficult for people to sustain themselves. Climate change is leading to the loss of livelihoods and income for many people who depend on farming or agriculture in some other form. And they're having to leave their communities, going elsewhere to look for ways to gain an income, right? So I think, with the way things are going, trending in terms of, tensions between countries with, insurrections and civil war within countries, I think the needs are going to increase both in terms of the conflict component, but also the natural disaster component.
Doug, thanks a lot for that, and thank you for coming on. Our time is almost up, so I'm going to say a few comments here as farewell. So we're still working with the content and the format of these things. I'm trying to keep it to 25 minutes to keep it digestible. So if you have any comments on the format, other issues you would like to see us discuss, or any other comments, please visit us on Facebook, the Montana World Affairs Council, where we will also be posting the recordings and many other key issues of international importance. You can always take a look there. So please let me know if you would like anything else to appear here. Now, very quickly for next week. Next week is going to be very interesting. We have UN week next week, and I'm extremely pleased that we will have on Tuesday and Thursday 2 very senior UN officials joining us. The first is Charles Petrie. Charles is a 30-year UN veteran who was a senior UN official in many places over the past years. He's going to be asking the question, is the UN worth saving? And really no better person to be asking that than somebody who has given so much of his life and his time to the United Nations. That will be Tuesday, the 7th of April, 9:30 to 10 a.m. Mountain Time. Then on Thursday, the 9th of April, we have Mark Cutts. Mark Cutts is the senior UN official based in Turkey for the Syria response, where millions of Syrians are now being hosted from 12 to 12:30 Mountain Time. Mark is going to be talking about the most dangerous place on earth, which is Idlib in northern Syria. So we're very pleased to have those very senior UN guests on. The week following, we're going to have a public health special with some experts on public health from around the world. So please, once again, if you like this, please like us on Facebook and send me any comments you may have. Thank you all very much for joining us. Spread the good word, be well, and hope to see you next week.